You're suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation for theft of company property. I never went into Container Yard 9. The badge logs say otherwise. The footage says otherwise. Then you should look at it again, carefully. Who exactly do you think you're talking to? I know exactly who I'm talking to. The problem is that you don't. Security will take you downstairs. 4 years. I've worked here 4 years. And in 4 years, you're still a night shift loader. 2 guards walked the man known to everyone in the building as August Miller through the main lobby at 11:20 in the morning, past the fountain, past the reception desk, past employees who stopped what they were doing to watch, and then looked away the moment he raised his eyes. On his gray warehouse badge, the name printed beneath his photo was his mother's maiden name, a tiny detail that had kept Desmond Vance from ever looking twice at a night shift worker. In his hands was a cardboard box holding exactly 3 things: a worn pair of work gloves, a water bottle, and a small notebook nobody had bothered to check. 4 years in warehouse, 3 had taught him how to unload a container in 40 minutes, how to remember every number stamped on a crate wall, and how to let an insult slide off his shoulders without his face ever changing. He said nothing. He had never said anything. If you have ever been the person an entire building walked past as though you did not exist, stay with this story until the very end, because what happens in that 22nd floor conference room at 9 o'clock the next morning is going to make you want to rise out of your chair. There was one question Desmond Vance forgot to ask before he signed that suspension order. He never once asked why a 34-year-old man would take the night shift for 4 straight years in a warehouse that he himself did not dare walk into after midnight. And on the 4th floor, in a records room with no windows, Marlo Redgrave heard the news before August had even reached the parking lot. She pulled a tin box from under her bed that evening, and for the first time since she began collecting those files, she opened it for someone else. If you want to know what was inside that tin box, tap the like button so we know you're here. Subscribe now, because this story only gets bigger from here. And share it with someone you think needs to hear it too. 11 o'clock the night before, warehouse number 3 at Ashgrove Holdings was lit up the way it was every night, and August was the second person to clock in for the shift. He was always the second. The first was a 22-year-old kid who had only been there 3 months, and starting in the 2nd week, August had quietly let him keep the first spot, because the first person to clock in was the one who had to switch on the entire lighting system in Section B, and Section B was cold. 4 years there had taught him many things, but the first thing he had learned was that no one noticed small things like that, and precisely because no one noticed them, they were worth doing. He pulled on a pair of safety gloves worn so thin that the stitching showed through at the thumb, raised the rolling door of Bay 3, and began. He carried the first 4 crates on his left shoulder, the 5th on his left shoulder too, the 10th still on his left, and no one in the warehouse asked why, because they all knew. His right shoulder had been ruined since he was 28. He had never told anyone what happened, and no one had ever asked. So over 4 years it had simply become a fact of the warehouse, like the door in Section C that had to be lifted before it would close, or the coffee machine in the break room that had been broken since January, and no one had bothered to replace. People called him the left shoulder guy. Some of them didn't even know his name. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Section B was 2/3 empty, and August walked along the row of containers to check the identification numbers before preparing the inventory report, a job the shift supervisor was supposed to do, but hadn't done in 3 years. He read every line of numbers with his eyes, and didn't use the scanner, because the scanner recorded the time and location of the person using it, while eyes recorded nothing. At the 9th container from the front of the row, he stopped. The seal on the door latch carried 7 digits. August stood motionless in front of it longer than necessary. Since March, Ashgrove's entire system had switched to 9-digit seal codes, a change announced on a sheet of paper posted on the break room bulletin board, its corner peeling away within 2 days. He had read that notice. He even remembered the day it had been posted. The seal in front of him shouldn't have existed on any container that had left the port of Baltimore after March. And yet there it was, beneath the high-intensity lights, attached to a cargo unit scheduled to depart the following morning. August took his phone from his breast pocket and snapped a picture, then stepped back 3 paces and took another, so the container number would appear in the frame as well. He didn't report it to anyone. He put the phone away and returned to Bay 3 to keep loading freight. And for the next 40 minutes, he worked exactly as he did every night. No faster, no slower, never once glancing toward that row of containers, At 2:45, the 22-year-old asked if he wanted to take a break. August said no. "You go ahead. I'll keep an eye on things." The kid thanked him and went to the break room, leaving August alone in Bay 3 with the steady hum of the ventilation fans overhead. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, an 18-wheel truck turned in through the East Service Gate. The East Service Gate had no scheduled truck arrivals after midnight. August knew that because he was the one who printed the schedule and posted it on the bulletin board every Monday. Another job the shift supervisor was supposed to do. He stepped out of Bay 3, moved into the shadowed space between two pallet racks, and watched the truck crawl across the yard without its headlights on, only the amber marker lights blinking along the top of the cab. It stopped beside the 9th container in the row. 2 men got out. They weren't wearing company reflective vests. August didn't step forward. He didn't call security. He didn't shout a word. And if anyone had seen him then, they would have seen only a night shift loader leaning against a pallet rack, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his expression unchanged. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, worn smooth at all 4 corners, opened it to the page he had been writing on, and copied down the truck's license plate in steady handwriting, without trembling, without rushing. Beneath the plate number, he wrote the date. Beneath the date, he wrote the time. Then he closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket, and returned to Bay 3. The truck left through the service gate at 3:27. By 5 o'clock in the morning, Section B was completely empty, and August signed the inventory report with a note at the bottom of the page that he knew no one would read. At 6:10, he washed his hands at the sink outside the bay, removed his gloves, and sat on the concrete step, waiting for the shift to end. The 22-year-old sat down beside him and said it had been a quiet night. August said, yes, it had been quiet. At 5 minutes to 7, the internal phone in the supervisor's office rang. The man on duty answered, then raised his head and looked out across the yard, where August was sitting. He stepped outside and spoke in the voice of someone passing along an order he didn't understand himself. The 18th floor wants you upstairs. It had happened 3 weeks earlier. And August still remembered the exact number, 7 minutes. Because in 4 years at warehouse number 3, it was the only time he'd ever been late. The night before, a shipment of refrigeration equipment had missed its train because one line on the customs declaration had been entered incorrectly. And if it wasn't repacked and resealed before 6 o'clock in the morning, the entire shipment would miss its departure by another 4 days. And 4 days with refrigerated cargo meant the whole load would become garbage. The shift supervisor had gone home at 11 o'clock. Only 3 men remained on the night shift. August stayed another 4 hours after his own shift ended, without clocking in, without filing a report, without anyone asking him to. And by 6:15, the shipment was on the train exactly as scheduled. He got home at 7 o'clock, slept for 2.5 hours, and the next day he arrived at the warehouse at 11:07 instead of exactly 11 o'clock. The disciplinary report was written that same afternoon. The person who prepared it was a young human resources employee August had never met before, and she read the contents aloud as if she were reading from a menu, then pushed the paper across the desk with a pen. He picked up the pen. He didn't mention the 4 hours from the night before. He didn't mention the shipment, didn't mention the train, didn't ask why. Nowhere in Ashgrove Holdings' entire timekeeping system was there a single line showing that he'd stayed behind. He signed his name in the blank box at the lower right corner, pushed the paper back, and said thank you. The human resources employee looked at him for a second, her brow tightening slightly, as though something about his reaction didn't match what she was used to seeing. Then she slipped the document into her folder and left. His 7 minutes of lateness went into the record. His 4 hours didn't exist anywhere. That afternoon, when August walked out to the employee parking lot behind the warehouse, a gray sedan was parked in the farthest row, and a 71-year-old man was leaning against the driver's door with both hands in the pockets of his coat. Harlan Briscoe had been waiting there for 40 minutes. He didn't bother with a greeting. He watched August approach, looked at the protective gloves stuffed into his back pocket, watched the way he unlocked his car with his left hand, then said, I just read that report. 7 minutes. August said, yeah, Harlan said. You know there are men on this dock who wouldn't believe me if I told them that story. August set his toolbox on the back seat. Harlan stepped into the space between the 2 cars, lowering his voice even though there was no one else in the lot, and said, I've got 4 men ready to go into that building tonight. Just 4. This ends before midnight, and tomorrow morning all you have to do is walk into your chair. August closed the car door and turned to look at him. He said, "He was my father's man. My father trusted him for 11 years, and there are at least 6 people left in this organization who still remember that. If I move against him without paperwork, those 6 aren't going to think he betrayed us. They're going to think the son just cleaned out one of his father's people. And then every one of them will start wondering when their turn is coming." Harlan said nothing. He'd heard this answer 3 times in 4 years, each time in different words, and each time he'd walked away feeling as though he'd lost an argument he knew he was right about. He said, "Your grandfather wouldn't have waited this long." August said, "My grandfather didn't have to wait, because in his time people still knew how to be afraid. Now people are only afraid of paperwork." Then he slid behind the wheel and said, "I need the entire harbor to see the reason, Harlan. Not hear about it afterward. See it. As long as he believes he's winning, he'll keep doing it. And every time he does, that's one more line in my ledger." Harlan tapped 2 fingers against the roof of the car. A soft knock like the period at the end of a story that wasn't finished yet, then stepped back. Before August started the engine, Harlan bent toward the window and said one final thing, very quietly. "He doesn't need you to be wrong, August. He only needs you to look wrong." 3 weeks later, at Container Yard number 9, an 18-wheeler came through the eastern service gate with its headlights off. On the 4th floor of the Ash Grove Holdings building, there was a room that the emergency evacuation map posted on the hallway wall called the Records Archive, and for nearly a year, exactly 1 person had entered it each day. The room had no windows. There were 4 rows of metal shelving that reached all the way to the ceiling, a desk pushed against the wall, and a fluorescent light in the eastern corner that sometimes flickered once before returning to normal, something it had been doing since before Marlo Redgrave took the job and would continue doing long afterward, because replacing it required a maintenance request, and no one approved maintenance requests for the 4th floor. At 7:15 in the morning, the door opened, and someone from the records department set a stack of files about 4 knuckles thick on the edge of her desk. "This is priority," the person said. Then they turned and walked away before she could even lift her head. There was a stack like that every week, and every week there were those same 3 words, and for nearly a year, not once had anything labeled priority actually needed to be handled before anything else. Marlo pulled the stack closer. She opened her private notebook, wrote down the date, the time it was received, the name of the person who delivered it, and the number of files. No company procedure required her to do that. No one checked, but she wrote it down every single time, for 8 straight months, in small, even handwriting. When she reached up to the second shelf for a ring binder, the left sleeve of her blouse slipped below her elbow, and she pulled it back into place with a quick, practiced motion that looked more like instinct than intention, covering the scarred skin that ran from her wrist upward along her arm. Then she sat down and began working. At 6 o'clock in the evening, she left the building, and by 6:45 she was at Elm Ridge, a 2-story nursing home about 4 miles north of the port, where the hallways smelled of disinfectant, and a television played all day in the common room, even though almost no one watched it. Room number 14 was at the far end of the corridor. Her father sat in his wheelchair facing the window, just as he did every Tuesday evening, just as he had every Tuesday evening for the past 2 years since the stroke had taken away his ability to speak. Marlo pulled a chair closer, sat down on his right side, and opened the newspaper she had bought at a gas station on the way there. She read the weather section first, then the sports section, then the story about the city repairing the bridge on Hanover Avenue. She read slowly, pausing where the commas told her to pause, and now and then she skipped a story if she thought he wouldn't like it. He didn't turn his head. His right hand, the only hand he could still move, rested motionless in his lap, and didn't stir once. When she finished the newspaper, she told him about her day. She told him about the light in the corner of the archive room. She told him that 3 files had been placed under the wrong codes that week, and that she had found all 3. She spoke as though he were answering her, leaving silences in exactly the places where a real conversation would have them, and over the past 2 years, she had grown used to filling both sides. At 7:40, a gray-haired nun came in carrying a folder of bills. Sister Maeve Donnelly had worked at Elm Ridge for 26 years, and she was the only person there who knew the entire story of this family, though she had never once brought it up. She handed Marlo the bill and said they had adjusted the specialized care fee for that month. Marlo looked at the number on the final line. It was $400 higher than the month before. She folded the paper in half, then into quarters, slipped it into her coat pocket, and said, I'll take care of it. Sister Maeve remained in the doorway for another moment, as though she wanted to say something, then decided against it. At 8 o'clock, Marlowe stood and prepared to leave. She pulled the blanket higher over her father's knees, adjusted the pillow behind his back, then bent down until her face was level with his, close enough that if he wanted to look at her, all he had to do was shift his eyes. "I'm still trying, Dad," she said. "I know what you think, but I'm still trying." He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the window, where there was nothing but the parking lot and a street light. She straightened, said, "I'll come back tomorrow," and walked out into the hallway. 8 years earlier, after that night in the apartment on the east side of the city, her father hadn't spoken a single word to her for 4 straight months. Not one accusation, not one question, not a sound. And for the 8 years since then, Marlowe Redgrave had been certain she understood exactly what that silence meant, that he had kept it because he couldn't forgive her, and she carried that belief with her every Tuesday evening as she entered room number 14, read the newspaper, told him about her day, and then walked out again. She had been wrong for 8 years. But it would be a very long time before she learned that. The first time August Halloran walked into the records room on the 4th floor was on an October morning the year before, at 5:55, just after he'd finished the night shift, with the Area B inventory reports still in his hand. According to procedure, they were supposed to go to the shift supervisor, but the supervisor hadn't arrived yet, and the duty clerk told him to take them down to the 4th floor and leave them with records, because someone was always there early. He took the stairs because the elevator reserved for office staff wouldn't accept a warehouse employee's badge. He pushed open the door at the end of the 4th floor hallway and found the lights already on, one bulb in the eastern corner flickering once before, glowing steadily again, and a woman sitting at a desk against the wall, writing. She looked up. Before he had the chance to say anything, she spoke first. "Good morning," she said. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." August stood still in the doorway, and for the next 3 seconds, what moved through his mind wasn't warmth. For 4 years, the name Halloran had been something people lowered their voices to say around the port of Baltimore, and during those same 4 years he'd arranged everything, so no one in this building would connect that name with the left-shouldered dock worker in warehouse number 3. His personnel file showed only an initial. His badge carried only an A and his mother's surname. People called him the left-shoulder guy, called him that fellow from warehouse 3, and once Human Resources had called him Halloway for 15 straight minutes without him bothering to correct them. So when someone inside this building said his name correctly before he'd even introduced himself, his first reaction wasn't comfort. He looked at the desk. He looked at the open notebook. He looked at the way she was sitting, the way she held her pen, the way her eyes returned to the page the moment she'd finished asking him the question. And in those 3 seconds, he read everything he needed to read, that she hadn't looked at him any longer than normal, that she wasn't waiting for a reaction, that she'd offered coffee in the way a person offered it to everyone. She didn't know anything. She was simply the kind of person who made a habit of remembering other people's names. He said, "No, thank you. I'm heading home soon." Then he set the stack of reports on the edge of the desk. She pulled them closer, opened the notebook beside her, and began to write. August watched her record the date, then the time, then his name. "What are you writing?" he asked. She didn't stop moving the pen. "Everything that comes through this door," she said. He glanced at the notebook. It was already more than half full, the handwriting small and even, without a single line crossed out. "That's not your job," he said. "No," she replied, and this time she looked up at him. "But someday, someone may need to know." August didn't ask another question. He gave a single nod, said thank you, and left. But when he reached the hallway, he stopped at the top of the stairwell and stood there for about 10 seconds. Because in 4 years of moving through that building, he'd learned to recognize 2 kinds of people very quickly. The ones who did what they were asked to do, and the ones who did what no one asked them to do. And the second kind was rare enough that every time he encountered one, he stopped. The following week, he came down to the 4th floor again at 5:55 with another stack of Area B inventory reports. No one had told him to bring them. The shift supervisor had been there since 5:30 that morning, and the reports should have been sitting on his desk. August brought them to the 4th floor anyway. The week after that, he did the same, and the week after that, for nearly a year, every Thursday morning at 5:55, the door to the 4th floor records room opened, and a man coming off the night shift placed a stack of papers on the edge of the desk, And a woman wrote down the date, the time, and his name. They didn't talk much. Some weeks there was only a single greeting. Some weeks she asked whether the night had been quiet, and he said it had, then left. But by the 4th month, she had begun leaving a cup of coffee waiting on the edge of the desk every Thursday morning, without saying anything, without asking again, and he began drinking it. By the 7th month, he realized he was choosing Area B for loading on Wednesday nights, even when Area C was lighter, simply because the Area B report was the only one he had a legitimate reason to carry down to the 4th floor. He didn't tell anyone that. One Thursday morning at the end of April, she wasn't there. On the desk lay an unsigned leave request she hadn't submitted yet. Face up, and August set the inventory reports beside it. His eyes passed over the address listed in the personal information section. An apartment on Delacourt Street, 2nd floor, above a laundromat. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, and then turned away, and he didn't think about it again. But August Halloran was the kind of man who remembered every number printed on the side of a shipping container after seeing it once, and that address stayed in his mind the way everything else did, resting there quietly, unused, until one night much later, when he needed to know whom to find and where to find her. It happened on a Friday afternoon, when Marlowe went down to the warehouse area in the back to retrieve 3 files of bills of lading from the previous quarter that the records department had mistakenly sent down there in February. She passed the row of workers' personal lockers, and at the far end, beneath a ceiling light that had yellowed with age, a woman stood in front of an open locker, folding a reflective safety vest and placing it into a plastic bag. She was doing it very slowly. She smoothed both shoulders of the vest before folding it, then folded it in half, then smoothed it once more, as though the vest were about to be put away for a very long time, and she wanted it to still be neat when it was taken out again. Marlowe knew her. Anyone who had worked in that building for more than 6 months knew Ruth Abernathy, the 58-year-old woman who had spent 19 years in the warehouse, who knew the location of every inventory code in Section C by heart, and could find a missing crate faster than the computer system could. Marlowe stopped and asked if she was changing lockers. Ruth looked up, took a second to recognize her, then smiled. "No, sweetheart," she said. "I'm clearing out." Marlowe asked if she'd been fired. Ruth shook her head, and her smile didn't disappear. It simply went still on her face and became something else. "Nobody fired me," she said. "That's the clever part." Then she told her the story without rushing, finishing the folding of her gloves and coiling the strap of her identification badge as she spoke. In September of the year before, during an afternoon shift, she discovered that the seals on 2 containers in the outermost row had been opened and fastened shut again. She took photographs, wrote a 1-page report, signed it, and submitted it to the operations office. 3 weeks later, her weekly schedule dropped from 5 shifts to 3. She asked the supervisor about it. The supervisor said it was a staffing adjustment for the slow season. She waited another month. 3 shifts became 1. She went upstairs and asked again, and this time they handed her a printed labor allocation sheet with a valid signature on it, explaining that under company policy, workers over 55 were given priority for reduced night hours for health reasons, and she didn't know how she was supposed to argue with a proper piece of paper like that. This week, there wasn't a single line left on her schedule at all. No termination letter, no meeting, no one said a word to her. There was only an empty space on the schedule where her name should have been, and a notice reminding employees that under company rules, anyone who recorded no working hours for 6 consecutive weeks would automatically be moved to inactive contract status. "They didn't fire me," Ruth said as she tied the top of the plastic bag closed. "They just pulled the bricks out from under my feet one at a time until I fell on my own. And then on paper, it says I fell by myself." Marlowe couldn't say anything for several seconds. She asked if Ruth had much to carry. Ruth said just this bag and a shoebox in the upper locker. Marlowe reached for the box and picked up the plastic bag as well, and Ruth tried to take them back, but Marlowe was already walking ahead. The 2 of them went down the warehouse corridor, through the rear door, and out into the East employee parking lot, where an old pickup truck sat in the outermost row. Along the way, they passed 4 people. No one stopped. One person nodded to Ruth and then looked away very quickly, the way people look away when they know exactly what's happening and have already decided that knowing is enough. Ruth opened the back of the truck. Marlowe placed the box and the bag inside. Ruth straightened, brushed her hands against her pants, then looked at her for a moment. "Your name is Marlowe, isn't it?" she said. "Fourth floor archive room." Marlowe nodded. Ruth thanked her for carrying the things. Then she added one more sentence, without a trace of self-pity, her voice as calm as though she were making a remark about the weather. "You're the only person who's spoken to me all day." She got into the truck, started the engine, and backed out of the parking space. Marlowe remained standing in the lot until the pickup turned beyond the gate and disappeared from sight. That evening, she returned to her apartment on Delacorte Street, later than usual. She didn't turn on the television. She took a new ring binder from her desk drawer, the inexpensive gray kind she always bought at the stationery store on the corner, and sat down with a pen in her hand. On the first page, she wrote Ruth's name, her age, her years of service, the date she had submitted the report about the 2 containers, and the entire timeline of her disappearing shifts: 5 shifts, 3 shifts, 1 shift, no shifts at all, together with the dates of every adjustment Marlowe could trace through the 4th floor records system. She wrote slowly and left nothing out. Then she turned the binder over, and on the front cover, in her own handwriting, she wrote 4 words: "The people no one asked." She placed the file in a place she had kept for 5 years, and closed the lid. The place Marlowe Redgrave had kept for 5 years was a square tin box, the kind of cookie tin people sold during the holidays, with the paint chipped away at 2 corners, tucked beneath the bed in her 2nd-floor apartment on Delacorte Street, above a laundromat that stayed open until 10 o'clock at night. She pulled it out and set it on the floor, sat cross-legged beside it, then lifted the lid. Inside wasn't one file. There were 11 files, stacked one on top of another, and the one she had added that evening rested at the very top. She lifted them out one by one and placed them to her left, slowly, in the reverse order from which they had been put inside, and every file was a name. A forklift driver who had been blamed for a missing shipment, even though he hadn't been on duty that shift. A young accounting employee who had sent 2 letters asking about discrepancies in fuel invoices, and had been transferred to the Dundalk branch within a month. A night security guard who had reported trucks entering through the service gate, outside the posted schedule, and had been told that he should focus on the responsibilities within his own assigned area. Each file held a timeline. Each file contained a sequence of dates that matched one another too closely to be called coincidence anymore. When she reached the last file, the one lying against the bottom of the box, it wasn't Ashgrove Holdings paperwork. It was a copy of an insurance company's scene investigation report, dated 8 years earlier, concerning a fire in a 3-story apartment building on the east side of Baltimore. There were 3 lines in that report Marlowe had read so many times that she could recite them without looking. The first stated that the building management company wasn't at fault in maintaining the electrical system. The second stated that previous complaints from residents regarding the kitchen outlet lacked sufficient technical grounds to establish liability. The third was the signature of the claims investigator responsible for the case, and the name written beneath that signature was Desmond Vance. 8 years earlier, Marlowe had submitted 3 written complaints about the outlet behind the kitchen stove becoming abnormally hot. 3 times she had taken them down to the building management office, and 3 times she had received the same response, that the complaint had been noted. She was 19 then. No one took a handwritten complaint from a 19-year-old girl seriously, and she had learned that in the kind of way a person only learns something once in a lifetime. There had been 3 people inside the apartment that night. The next morning, only 2 walked out. Nell Redgrave was 3 years older than she was, in her final year of nursing school at the community college on the north side, and Marlowe hadn't kept many images of her sister in her memory except for 2 things. The first was her laughter, that laugh that was always louder than necessary, the one Nell would let loose even at jokes that weren't funny. And the second was coffee. Nell made coffee so strong that Marlowe once joked she could use it to paste wallpaper to the walls, and Nell had answered that if she wanted to drink brown water, she could go buy it at the gas station. For 8 years, every time Marlowe made coffee, she brewed it a little weaker than she actually wanted. 3 years after the fire, she sat in the public library on Pratt Avenue and searched Desmond Vance's name in the state's corporate database, and his name appeared on the executive roster of a port logistics company called Ashgrove Holdings. He had left the insurance industry. He sat on the 18th floor. 2 years after that, when Ashgrove advertised an opening for a records clerk on the 4th floor, with pay below the market average, no path for advancement, and no other applicants, Marlowe Redgrave applied. She didn't apply because she needed a job, though she did need one. She applied because she had spent 2 years studying the document flow structure of a port transportation company, and she had come to understand something that the people sitting on the upper floors never thought about. That the person who saw the most inside a building wasn't the person sitting highest above everyone else, but the person through whose hands every piece of paper had to pass before it was put away. That chair was on the 4th floor, inside a windowless room, beneath a fluorescent light that flickered once from time to time. No one competed with her for it. For nearly a year, every time someone placed a stack of files on the edge of her desk and said those 3 words, "This is priority," they believed they were handing work to someone whose name wasn't worth remembering. Marlowe placed Ruth Abernathy's ring binder on top of the stack, closed the lid of the tin box, and pushed it back into its place beneath the bed. She had waited 5 years. She could wait longer. The 3rd quarter board meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in the conference room on the 22nd floor, and Desmond Vance presented the 4th item on the agenda, the report on operating results for the refrigerated container division. He didn't use slides. He had never used slides. He stood at the head of the table with a thin stack of papers in his hand and spoke in the voice of a man sharing unpleasant news with old friends, saying that the refrigerated container division had continued to post a loss that quarter, the 5th consecutive quarter, and that the causes remained the cost of fuel for the generator units and the rate of cargo spoilage during transfer. He gave them the figure, paused for exactly 1 beat, then added that he knew it wasn't an easy number to hear, and that if anyone in the room had a better approach, he sincerely wanted to hear it. The way he said those words made them sound like an invitation, rather than a door quietly being closed. On the right side of the table, an outside board member who had served on the Ashgrove Holdings board for 7 years and was the only person in the room with a background in port operations, closed his folder and began to speak. He had gotten only 3 words into his question. "I have a question about," when Desmond turned his entire body toward him. "Bill," Desmond said, "before you ask, let me ask you something first. How's your daughter doing? She started school this term, didn't she?" There was a faint sound of chairs shifting in the room. The man named Bill stopped, and that pause lasted more than a second longer than it naturally should have. He said, "She's doing well, thank you. First year in Annapolis." Desmond nodded slowly and said he'd heard, then added that the month before, when he had passed through Pier Number 2, he had thought of it because the foreman's son there had just started at the same school, and he had told them, "There certainly seemed to be a lot of good news this year." Then he said, "What were you going to ask, Bill?" The man opened his folder, then closed it again. He said, "Never mind. It's nothing. Let's stay with your plan." Desmond said thank you, then turned back toward the head of the table and finished the final 2 paragraphs of his report. The chairman asked whether anyone had any other comments. No one did. The 4th item was approved with the simultaneous nods of 11 people, taking a total of 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and the meeting minutes later contained only a single line, stating that the board had acknowledged the report and unanimously agreed to maintain the current operating structure of the refrigerated container division. 40 minutes later, after the conference room had emptied, Desmond Vance returned to his office, closed the door, and called the information technology department on the internal line. He didn't waste words. He said he needed the activity log from the photocopier on the 4th floor, all of it, covering the previous 3 months, including user card codes, timestamps, and the number of copies made during each session. The person on the other end asked whether he wanted an official request ticket opened, because under procedure, user data required approval from the compliance department. Desmond said, "Of course. Go ahead and open the ticket, and put down the reason as a review of 3rd quarter office supply costs." Then he added, in the gentle tone of someone mentioning a minor detail, that if it wasn't too much trouble, they could send him a preliminary copy that afternoon and complete the ticket afterward. The person on the other end said, "Yes, of course, Mr. Vance." Desmond hung up, turned his chair toward the window overlooking the eastern container yard, and remained there in silence for a long while. He didn't suspect anyone in particular. He was simply a 46-year-old man who had lived long enough inside buildings like this one to know that when something began to grow a little too quiet, it was usually because someone down below was working very hard without telling anyone. Cole Thackeray was 31 years old and worked in business development on the 12th floor. And during the first 6 weeks of that summer, he found 7 different reasons to go down to the 4th floor. The first time was to look up an old bill of lading that his assistant could easily have found for him. The second was to return a file that he could simply have dropped into the internal transfer tray. By the 4th time, He no longer bothered inventing a reason at all. He just pushed open the door, leaned one shoulder against the metal shelving near her desk, and talked. During a department meeting near the end of June, when someone complained that the fourth-floor archive department was too slow, Cole spoke up in its defense, saying that the girl down there was more meticulous than the entire records department, that every time he went downstairs, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Marlo wasn't at that meeting, and the only reason she knew he had said it was because he told her himself 3 days later, telling it in the kind of way that made the listener understand it was a gift, and gifts usually came with debts attached. Then he made her an offer. He said the 12th floor needed someone to manage client files, a specialist position, a salary 1.5 grades higher. With a window, he said all he had to do was say one word to the department head and it would be done. Marlo thanked him and said she was fine where she was. He laughed, told her to think about it, then went back upstairs. 2 weeks later, he returned with the exact same offer, this time accompanied by a printed job description that he placed on the edge of her desk. She didn't open it. She said thank you, but I really don't need it. The third time was on a Thursday afternoon near the end of July. This time, he didn't bring any paperwork with him at all. He stood in the middle of the room with his arms folded and said, "You know I'm not used to being turned down 3 times, don't you?" Marlo said yes. I suppose that's true. His smile was still there, but one side of it had begun to tilt. He said, "I can't figure you out." Then he continued, and this time his voice was softer, almost intimate, the kind of intimacy used by someone trying to make it sound as though he was speaking out of concern. "You're 27, he said. "You live in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat. Every Tuesday night, you drive 4 miles north to pay for an old man in a wheelchair who doesn't even know who you are. What exactly are you waiting for, Marlo?" In the archive room, the overhead light flickered once before, settling back into its dull hum. Marlo set down her pen. She raised her head and looked straight at him, and her voice wasn't even slightly louder than it had been before. "I'm waiting for my turn," she said. Cole stood there for another 2 seconds. There was something in the way she said it that left him unable to find his next line, and for a man like Cole Thackeray, not knowing what to say next was an experience he wasn't accustomed to and didn't enjoy. He shrugged, said "Suit yourself," then turned toward the door. His smile disappeared completely the moment she could no longer see his face. At the far end of the 4th-floor hallway, near the stairwell, a man in a work jacket stood holding an inventory report. Cole recognized him immediately, not by name, but by type. Warehouse jacket, steel-toe work boots, a gray identification badge hanging from his neck instead of the blue one worn by office staff. He had passed this man no fewer than 20 times over 4 years and had never once stopped for more than half a second. But this time he stopped, because in the previous 30 seconds he had just been rejected for the 3rd time by a girl on the 4th floor. And now at the end of the hallway, leading into that very room, stood a night shift loader, waiting with a stack of papers in his hand at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when his shift wouldn't begin for another 7 hours. Cole walked past him. The man didn't look at him. Cole glanced down at the papers in the man's hand, saw the words Section B Inventory Report, then stepped into the elevator. On the ride back up to the 12th floor, he thought about it. And he thought about it the way a man like him always did, which meant beginning with the assumption that if a woman rejected him, there had to be another man behind the reason. He had misunderstood almost everything that had happened in those 30 seconds. But that misunderstanding would eventually make a great many people pay the price. Cole Thackeray went up to the 18th floor on a Wednesday afternoon without an appointment and told the secretary he only needed 5 minutes. Desmond Vance gave him 15. Cole sat down and spent about 2 minutes circling around the subject of a pending transportation contract. Then his tone changed, and he said there was something happening in the warehouse area that he thought Desmond should know about. He said there was a night shift loader in warehouse number 3 who, for the past several months, had been going up to the 4th floor every week outside his working hours, carrying inventory reports that were supposed to be submitted to the shift supervisor. He said he didn't know what was going on, but a loader had no reason to be moving between floors like that. Desmond listened to all of it without interrupting and without taking notes. Then he asked what the man's name was. Cole said he couldn't remember, only that he knew his face. Desmond nodded and said, "Thank you. I'll have someone look into it." After Cole left the office, Desmond remained still for a while, then opened a drawer and took out the printout the information technology department had sent up the previous afternoon. the activity log from the fourth-floor photocopier covering the past 3 months. During those 3 months, one user card code had appeared 129 times outside normal office hours, most often between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning, with a small and irregular number of copies each time. 2 copies, 3 copies, 1 copy. No one photocopied ordinary work documents that way. People copied that way when they were reproducing papers, 1 sheet at a time, in sequence, over the course of months. That card code belonged to the 4th-floor archive room. Desmond set the papers down on his desk and stared at them for a very long time. And while he stared, he wasn't thinking about a 27-year-old records clerk, because in his mind there was no possibility that someone in a position like hers could have started something like this on her own. He thought someone was using the 4th-floor position to move documents out of the building, and he needed it stopped before it reached the shipment in Yard 9. That shipment consisted of 48 crates of medical equipment that had been moved into Container Yard number 9 before dawn and entered into the system as lost during transfer, with a declared value of $400,000. Exactly $20,000 below the threshold at which Ashgrove Holdings' internal regulations required the loss to be reported to the Port Authority and the insurance company. Below that threshold, everything could be handled internally, with a report, an investigation conducted by the operations department itself, and a name. Desmond needed a name. Over the next 3 days, he summoned Cole Thackeray again, and this time Desmond was the one who spoke first. He said, "You were right. There is a problem in the warehouse area." He said he had ordered a review and discovered irregularities in the access control data. Then he pushed a printed access card log across the desk, with one line highlighted, stating that badge #3802, assigned to August Miller, had been scanned into Container Yard number 9 at 11:47 at night. Cole looked at that line and felt something warming in his chest, something he mistook for the satisfaction of a man who had just been proven right. Desmond said he needed someone from the business development department to sign the report as an independent party, so the file would be clean. Cole said, of course. By the end of that week, when the security department pulled the camera data from the eastern yard, they found a 32-second clip recorded from the light pole at the northern corner, showing a person wearing the gray work jacket used by warehouse employees walking along the row of containers, stopping at the last bay, and opening the door latch. The footage wasn't blurry. The camera wasn't broken. There was no missing period of data, no gap, no maintenance. The entire system had functioned normally throughout that whole week, and that was precisely what left August Halloran without a single argument to make. Because when a man is accused while a camera is malfunctioning, people still have room for doubt. But when the camera is working perfectly, and the screen shows a figure wearing exactly that kind of jacket, no one in the conference room wants to hear anything more. On the night he signed the report, Cole Thackeray went home to his apartment in Federal Hill, poured himself a drink, and sat down at his desk. He wasn't as pleased as he had expected to be. He had sat in Desmond Vance's office 3 times in 2 weeks, and by the 3rd visit, he had begun to notice something. In this entire story, the only person whose name appeared on the paperwork besides the night shift loader was Cole himself. His signature was in the box for the independent party. Desmond's signature wasn't anywhere. Cole opened a drawer, took out the small voice recorder he normally used to record calls with difficult clients, checked the battery, switched it on, and placed it beside the telephone. Then he dialed Desmond Vance's internal number and waited for the second ring. August Halloran's car was parked in the outermost row of the Eastern employee lot, and he sat inside it with the cardboard box on the passenger seat, both hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine still off. He stayed like that for 4 minutes. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number that wasn't saved in his contacts. It rang once and a half. Harlan Briscoe answered without saying hello. He only said, "I'm listening," in the voice of a man who'd been sitting beside the phone since 10 o'clock that morning. August looked through the windshield toward the eastern service gate and said 4 words. "Call everyone home. Tomorrow morning." The other end went silent for about 2 seconds. For 4 years, that was the sentence Harlan had waited to hear month after month, and it was also the sentence August had never once used, because in the Halloran family, calling everyone home didn't mean summoning a meeting. It meant the waiting part was over. It was something his grandfather had used exactly 3 times in 28 years, and all 3 had been times when the shape of this harbor changed. Harlan said, "What time?" August said, 9 o'clock. Then Harlan asked, "Are you sure?" August said, "No, but I'm out of time." He ended the call and set the phone down on the seat. Then he reached into the cardboard box, took out a small leather-bound notebook with all four corners worn smooth, and opened it across his lap. The first page was dated 4 years earlier, during his second week working at warehouse number 3, and the first line contained only 3 things: an 11-character container number, a timestamp, and 3 initials identifying the yard section. No comments, no sentences. The second page was the same, and the third, and the fourth. The handwriting was identical from beginning to end, the same size, the same slant, the same spacing between lines, so consistent that if someone flipped quickly through the notebook, the entries would look like a column of numbers printed by a machine, instead of words written by one hand over 4 years beneath high-pressure lights at 3 o'clock in the morning. Some pages had only 2 lines. Others were packed from top to bottom. Scattered among the container numbers were strings of truck license plates, each one paired with a time and a single letter marking the gate, and if they were read in chronological order, the pattern became clear. The same plates returned every 3 weeks, then every 2 weeks, then more and more often as time went on, closer together, appearing more frequently during hours when the company's official vehicle schedule showed nothing at all. About 1/3 of the way through the notebook, between 2 lines of numbers, there was a different kind of entry written into the left margin, one man's name, followed by the words Area C. It was the only line in 200 pages that contained a person's name. 4 years fit inside a notebook small enough to rest in one palm. And in those 4 years, there had been countless nights when August Halloran stood leaning against a pallet rack, watching a truck enter through a service gate with its headlights off, then took out this notebook and wrote it down, put it away, and returned to Bay 3 to finish loading out his shift. He had never stopped a single truck. He had never called security. He had never given anyone in that building a reason to think the left-shouldered guy in warehouse number 3 was something worth watching, because the day people started watching him would be the day this notebook stopped getting thicker. He turned to the last page with writing on it. It wasn't at the end of the notebook, but about 2/3 of the way through, and after it came nothing but blank pages. There was no container number on that page, no license plate, no time. Only one line, written 3 years earlier, on November 19th, in exactly the same handwriting. Not enough. August looked at those 2 words for a long time. 3 years earlier, he'd already had enough container numbers and enough timestamps to prove that cargo was leaving the harbor on nights when nothing had been scheduled. He could have handed everything to Harlan Briscoe the next morning, and Harlan would have taken care of the rest in a single night. And August had sat in this very car, in this exact parking space, and written those 2 words down because container numbers could prove that cargo had moved, but they couldn't prove who had signed to let it move. And in an organization where every man still remembered that Desmond Vance had once been the person his father trusted most, a night shift dock worker's notebook wouldn't be enough to make anyone nod in agreement. He needed something that connected the container yard all the way up to the 18th floor. He needed documents. He needed dates, signatures, the path of every sheet of paper. He needed exactly the kind of thing someone on the 4th floor had spent 8 months recording beneath a light bulb that occasionally flickered once. And until that morning, when 2 security guards walked on either side of him through the main lobby, August Halloran had never known that such a thing existed. He closed the notebook, slipped it into his breast pocket, and started the engine. The gray sedan was waiting for him in the parking lot of a diner on Boston Street, 3 miles from the harbor, and Harlan Briscoe slid into the passenger seat of August's car after carefully setting the cardboard box on the floor, as though it belonged to someone else. He didn't ask how that morning had gone. He said, "I made the calls. Everyone will be there at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Then he added that 3 men had asked him the exact same question, what Mr. Halloran intended to tell them. He said, "I couldn't answer them, because I don't know either." August said nothing for a while. Then he asked, "Do you remember the Marisol?" Harlan turned his head. Of course he remembered. 6 years earlier, an Ash Grove cargo ship had left the port of Baltimore on the very night a Level 2 storm warning was issued, and on its way out toward the bay it suffered an engine room failure, and 2 sailors never came home. The investigation ruled it a maritime risk. The company paid both families, both of them in Dundalk, 3 miles southeast of the docks, and the matter was closed. August said, "The order that sent that ship out that night wasn't signed by dispatch. It was signed by hand, on an internal directive, by my father, from prison." Harlan said nothing. He knew August's father had spent the final 4 years of his life in prison, and he also knew that during those 4 years, the only man allowed to visit him every month as a company representative had been Desmond Vance. August said he was still running things from inside. Vance carried the papers in. My father signed them. Vance carried them back out. That night there was a massive contractual penalty if the ship didn't leave before midnight, and my father chose the penalty over 2 human lives. Then he told him the rest, in a voice so calm that Harlan had to look at his face to make sure August was really saying what he thought he was saying. Vance kept the original directive, and on the signature line, the name written there now is mine. The car stayed silent for a very long time. Harlan asked, "What is he keeping it for? To take to the police?" August said, "No, the police closed that case 6 years ago, and a piece of paper without a witness is still only a piece of paper. He isn't keeping it for the police. He's keeping it for the 2 families in Dundalk." Harlan sat up straighter. August continued, and this time his voice slowed. "All he has to do is hand copies of that paper to those 2 women over there and give them one sentence, that the man who signed the order sending their husbands out that night was the Halloran son. He doesn't need a courtroom. He doesn't need an investigation. He only needs 2 women to tell that story to their neighbors. Then it'll travel back from Dundalk to the docks, and within a month, every man who ever worked for my grandfather and my father will have heard that August Halloran traded 2 lives for a contractual penalty." He stopped. "Do you know what has held this organization together for 4 generations, Harlan? It isn't money. Money is everywhere. It's the rule my grandfather laid down, that we don't touch people who can't defend themselves. The 2 men aboard the Marisol that night couldn't defend themselves. If people believe I signed that paper, then I'm not the head of anything anymore. I'm just a man with money. And on this harbor, a man with money can't keep anyone for more than 6 months." Harlan Briscoe was 71 years old and had worked for this family for 43 years, and in all those 43 years he'd never experienced a moment quite like this one, when he finally understood that the young man sitting beside him, the man whose name made people all across the Port of Baltimore lower their voices, had been more tightly bound than anyone in that building for 6 straight years. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" August said, "Because if I had, you would have sent men to his place that same night, and by the next morning that paper would have been in Dundalk, before I even had breakfast. He already arranged for that. I know it as surely as I know anything, because if I were him, I'd have done the same thing." Harlan asked, "So what do you have now?" August took the small notebook from his breast pocket and set it on the dashboard. He said, "I have 4 years of container numbers and the license plates of 11 trucks entering through the service gate outside the schedule. I know which routes he's selling, which nights he's selling them, and which direction the cargo goes after it leaves the gate." Harlan picked up the notebook, flipped through a few pages, then closed it and set it back down. He said, "You've got the cargo trail, August. You can prove the goods moved. But you don't have the timeline. You don't have the dates he signed. You don't have the path of each document. And you don't have anything connecting the container yard to the desk on the 18th floor. Without that, tomorrow morning you walk into that room carrying the handwriting of a night shift dock worker, while he has a paper with your name on it and 2 names in Dundalk. Do you know who they'll believe?" August stared out through the car window for a long time. Then he said, "Then I need the person who has it." And the instant he said those words, an image rose in his mind of a windowless room on the 4th floor, a light bulb that sometimes flickered once, and a woman bent over a desk, recording the date, the time, and his name in a notebook no one in the world had ever asked her to keep. The truth hidden beneath the bed in the apartment on Delacourt Street was about to be opened for the 2nd time, and this time, it was going to change everything. At 10 o'clock that night, the laundromat, on the ground floor of number 41 Delacourt Street, had just switched off its sign, and on the sidewalk outside, a man stood motionless with both hands in the pockets of his coat, his face tilted upward toward the 2nd floor window. He stood there for nearly 4 minutes. He didn't ring the bell, didn't call, didn't knock on the door, because over the past 4 years, August Halloran had learned that the quickest way to make someone close a door on you was to appear in front of them before they had been given the chance to decide whether they wanted to open it. At the 4th minute, the curtain over the 2nd floor window moved, and Marlo Redgrave looked down. She recognized him immediately. She stood still behind the glass for about 5 seconds, then disappeared from the window, and a moment later the wooden door beside the laundromat opened. She didn't ask how he knew where she lived. She simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in." The apartment had one room, a wooden table pushed against the kitchen wall, and 2 chairs that didn't match. August sat down in one of them. He said, "I was suspended this morning." She said, "I know. Everyone on the 4th floor knew before noon." Then she added, without waiting for him to ask, that she didn't believe a single word in that report. He asked why. She said, "Because I've read 4 reports almost exactly like it over the past 2 years, the same phrasing, the same way the conclusion was written, and all 4 people named in them don't work in that building anymore." August looked at her for a moment, then said, "I need your help with something, and I'm going to tell you plainly that it won't be safe for you." Marlowe stood, walked farther into the apartment, and when she came back, she was carrying a square tin box with the paint chipped from 2 corners of the lid. She placed it on the kitchen table and opened it. Then she took out the files one by one, arranging them in a row across the tabletop, and every time she set one down, she spoke a name. By the 11th file, there was no room left on the table, and she had to begin stacking them. August didn't say a word through any of it. He reached for the nearest file, opened it, and inside was a column of dates running down the left margin. 1 event on every line, each event paired with a document number, and beside every document number was the name of the person who approved it, along with the time the paper left the 4th floor archive room to go upstairs. He turned to the 2nd file, then the 3rd. He read quickly, the way a man reads when he is searching for something specific rather than trying to understand what is in front of him. And halfway through the 4th file, his hand stopped on a page. On that page was a sequence of dates from September of the year before, and on the 7th line was the number of an internal directive, the name of the person who approved it, the time the paper was received into the archive, the time it was removed, and the signature of the person who took it out. In 4 years of writing down container numbers beneath high-intensity lights, August Halloran had built 1/2 of a bridge. The other half was here, on this kitchen table, inside an old cookie tin, written in the small, even handwriting of a woman the entire building called the girl on the 4th floor. He knew at once that she was holding in her hands the path taken by every piece of paper that had left Desmond Vance's hands during the past 2 years, and that if even one timestamp in those records matched the night the Marisol sailed 6 years earlier, then the rope that had hung around his neck for 6 years would be taken away by someone who didn't even know it existed. She didn't know. She stood there, leaning against the edge of the table, waiting for him to speak. August closed the file. He said, "Do you understand what this is?" Marlowe said, "I understand that it's 11 names, and I understand that if I hand it to the wrong people, it'll disappear in a single afternoon." He said, "It's more than that." Then he fell silent, and in that silence he considered telling her who he was, considered it for exactly 3 seconds, and decided not to. Not because he didn't trust her, but because if she knew, then everything she did between now and tomorrow morning would become something she was doing for a man with power, and he didn't want what was lying on that kitchen table to be renamed loyalty. He said, "I can keep you out of this, Marlowe. I take these files with me. You stay here, and tomorrow you go down to the 4th floor the way you always do. If this falls apart, none of it will touch you." Marlowe looked at the open tin box on the table, then looked at him. She said, "I've stayed out of it for 8 years. Then she pulled out the 2nd chair and sat down across from him, and said, "Now you tell me exactly what you need, and I'll tell you which file it's in." Marlowe discovered it close to midnight, when she logged into the internal system from her personal computer to check a document number August needed, and a notice appeared at the top of the administration department's internal news page, stating that the digitization project for the 4th floor records archive would begin the next day, that all paper records would be boxed and transferred to an off-site storage facility at Sparrows Point for scanning and long-term preservation, and that the transport truck would arrive at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She read it 3 times. The project wasn't new. It had been approved the month before, and listed in the quarterly plan with an implementation date 2 weeks away. There was nothing illegal about moving it forward. There was nothing to challenge, nothing to report, and that was exactly what sent a chill down her spine, because once all the original paper records were sitting in a warehouse 12 miles away under the control of an outside contractor, everything she needed to cross-check would no longer be within her reach, and any page that disappeared during transport would become nothing more than a line in an inventory discrepancy report. She called August at 12:20. He answered on the first ring. He said, "My access card has been locked since noon." She said, I know, he said. Then don't go in. Marlowe said, I need 4 files. I know exactly which shelves they're on, and I need to compare them against the originals before those originals get on that truck. Then she hung up before he could say another word. At 7 o'clock the next morning, she didn't use the main entrance. She went around to the rear service entrance, where the cleaning department received supplies every morning, and walked in alongside 2 carts loaded with paper towels, nodding to the man in charge the same way she had nodded to him every time she passed him during the previous year. She took the stairs to the 4th floor. Inside the archive room, 4 empty cardboard boxes were already stacked in the corner, and a packing inventory sheet had been taped to the side of one of the shelves. She worked for 2 straight hours, pulling out one file after another, cross-checking, taking notes, and by 9:15 she had 4 ring binders and a thick stack of copies in her hands. She pressed everything against her chest, stepped into the hallway, and pushed the elevator button. When the doors opened, Cole Thackeray stepped out and stopped directly in the doorway. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood there with one hand braced against the edge of the elevator door, blocking the entire entrance, and said, "Where are you going this early?" Marlowe said, "Down to the records department." He said, "That's strange, because I just heard your access card is under review too." She said, "Please move out of the way." He didn't move. He tilted his head and looked down at the papers in her arms and said, "What are you carrying?" Marlowe stepped back, and as she did, the top binder slipped from her hands and the entire stack of copies spilled across the hallway floor, sheets scattering in a long trail over the tile. She bent down. Cole remained standing in the elevator doorway. Then, from the far end of the hallway, came the sound of the stairwell door opening. Ruth Abernathy walked in, and behind her were 2 men wearing gray work jackets, both of whom had once worked the night shift in warehouse number 3, and both of whom had left within the previous year and a half. Ruth didn't say anything. She walked straight to Marlowe, knelt down, and began picking up the papers. The 2 men knelt down as well. Cole watched them for about 3 seconds, then removed his hand from the edge of the door, stepped back into the elevator, and the doors closed. The 4 of them gathered every sheet from the floor in complete silence, no one asking anyone a single question, and when they were finished, Ruth stood up, brushed off both knees, handed the stack back to Marlowe, and said only, "There you go." Marlowe asked how she knew to come. Ruth said, "Someone called me last night. He didn't give me his name. He only said that tomorrow morning, a girl on the 4th floor was going to need a few people standing in the hallway, and when I asked who he was, he said, 'I'm the one who carries freight on his left shoulder.'" Inside the elevator on the way down, Cole Thackeray's phone vibrated. It was an internal call from the 18th floor. Desmond Vance said briefly that the final report on the missing shipment from Yard 9 had been completed, and that he needed Cole to come down and sign the witness section before 11 o'clock. Cole said yes. Then he asked one question, trying to keep his voice normal: whether anyone else would be signing besides him. The other end went silent for exactly 1 beat before answering, "Just you. You're the independent party." The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, and Cole Thackeray stepped into the hallway, and by then only one thought remained in his mind, that if anyone opened that file tomorrow, the only name they would see would be his. The transport truck would arrive in 4 hours, and there was less than 1 day left before the board meeting on the 22nd floor. Desmond Vance was already in the conference room on the 22nd floor at 8:40, 20 minutes early, and he placed a thin packet in front of every seat with the title, "Proposal for Restructuring, Logistics and Records Management." He had spent 3 weeks preparing it. Its purpose was to bring the entire warehouse operation, the documentation department, and the 4th floor records room under a single chain of command, with the reasons stated neatly on the 2nd page, that distributing approval authority across multiple departments was creating duplicated costs and control risks. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat in the 2nd chair from the head of the table, and at 5 minutes to 9 began his presentation. He spoke for 4 minutes. He talked about operational efficiency, about shortening the approval chain, and he had just turned to the 3rd page when the door at the far end of the room opened. 3 men walked in. None of them carried a briefcase. None of them sat down. They moved along the back wall, stopped at evenly spaced intervals, and stood there with their arms hanging loosely at their sides. The oldest of the 3 had to be over 60. The youngest looked about the same age as Cole Thackeray. There were 15 people in the room, most of them board members and senior executives of a publicly traded logistics company, and not one of them opened his mouth to ask who those 3 men were, because there is a kind of silence people don't need explained in order to understand, and that kind of silence had just entered the room with them. Desmond Vance stopped in the middle of a sentence. He looked toward the back of the room, and in those 2 seconds, something passed across his face that only the people sitting closest to him were able to see. Then the door opened a second time, and Harlan Briscoe walked in. He didn't apologize for interrupting the meeting. He went straight to the head of the table, rested one hand on the back of the chairman's chair, and the man sitting there rose on his own and stepped back without anyone telling him to. Harlan looked slowly around the room, pausing at each face, and in 43 years of working for this family, this was the first time he'd stood in that room as himself. He said, "I know most of you here only know me as a retired legal advisor whose name occasionally appears in the meeting minutes. That arrangement is no longer necessary." The door opened for the 3rd time. The man who entered wasn't wearing a suit. He wore the gray work jacket from the warehouse, the same jacket he'd been wearing the morning before, when 2 security guards escorted him through the main lobby at 11:20, and the sound of his safety boots striking the wooden floor of the 22nd floor conference room was unmistakably clear in the silence. He walked along the side of the long table, past where Cole Thackeray was sitting, past where Desmond Vance was standing, and stopped beside Harlan. He didn't look at anyone. Harlan Briscoe spoke, and his voice wasn't a bit louder than it had been before. "This is August Halloran." He paused for a beat. "Grandson of Cormac Halloran, son of Rourke." Then he said the final sentence. "And as of this morning, there is no one standing between him and this table anymore." No one in the room applauded. No one asked about appointment procedures. No one called for a vote. No one mentioned the corporate bylaws. Because in that moment, all 15 people seated around the long table on the 22nd floor of the Ashgrove Holdings building understood at the same time something most of them had spent years trying not to think about, that the Halloran name had been tied to this harbor since before the building itself existed, that 4 generations of cargo had moved through these docks under that name, and that the chairs each of them had occupied for so many years had never truly belonged to them. Bill, a board member for 7 years, was the first to stand. He rose slowly, both hands braced against the edge of the table. The chairman followed, then the entire row on the left, then the entire row on the right, and in less than 15 seconds, everyone in the room was on their feet. They weren't standing because of procedure. They stood the way people stand when they have suddenly remembered where they are. The coffee cup in Desmond Vance's hand slipped half an inch before he caught it, and a little coffee spilled into the saucer. He stood after everyone else, exactly 1 beat slower, and in that single beat, a great many things came to an end. Cole Thackeray didn't stand. He remained motionless in his chair, both hands resting on his thighs, while a very fast film began running through his mind. 4 years of passing a man in the hallway, without giving him even half a second of attention. The sentence he'd once said to Desmond Vance, that a warehouse loader had no reason to be moving between floors like that, and his own signature sitting in the independent verification box on a report he'd signed at 11 o'clock the previous morning. Outside the glass wall, in the hallway of the 22nd floor, Marlo Redgrave stood with 4 ring binders pressed against her chest. She had been there since 8:30 because of the only message he'd sent her the night before, a single unsigned line telling her to wait in the hallway and bring everything. Through the glass, she watched an entire room rise for the man who had delivered inventory reports to her at 5:55 every Thursday morning, the man who had drunk the cup of coffee. She left waiting on the edge of her desk for nearly a year, without once asking why she left it there. She lifted one hand to her mouth, and in that moment, Marlo Redgrave felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet, not from fear, but from the dizzying distance between what she'd known and what the truth turned out to be. August Halloran waited until everyone had taken their seats before he spoke, and his first sentence didn't mention revenue, didn't mention the 3rd quarter, didn't mention a single number. He said, "My grandfather started on this dock with 2 trucks and 1 promise. That promise was simple, that whatever cargo people placed in our hands would reach its destination, and anyone who worked under this name would be protected, even when they had nothing in their own hands with which to protect themselves." He said 4 generations of men on this harbor had lived by that promise. Some people in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. Some have only heard the stories, but every one of you is sitting in a building that was raised on top of it. Then he said, "For the last 4 years, I've worked the night shift loading freight in warehouse number 3, and I didn't go down there to learn the business. I went down there because that promise was being sold away, one shipment at a time, and I needed to know who was selling it and who they were selling it to before I walked into this room." He paused. He said, "I've stood in the container yard at 3 o'clock in the morning and watched cargo from this harbor leave through the service gate under my family's name, headed somewhere it was never supposed to go. 4 years. I counted every shipment." Then he walked to the door and opened it, and Marlo Redgrave stepped into the conference room on the 22nd floor with 4 ring binders pressed against her chest. She set them on the table, opened the first one, and began to read. She didn't read like someone who had been wronged. She read like a records clerk. Date, reference number, name of the person who approved it, time the document was received into 4th floor records, time it was removed, signature of the person who removed it. She read for 8 straight minutes without stopping, and during those 8 minutes the entire room listened as 2 years of Ashgrove Holdings documents were read aloud in chronological order, one sheet at a time, until what had first sounded like a dry list began to take on a shape no one could still call coincidence. Then she turned to the final report on the missing shipment from container yard number 9, laid it face up on the table, and said, "I want everyone to look at the 3rd line in the condition description. On that line, the cargo compartment seal code is written as a 7-digit number." She said, "Since March 11th, the company's entire sealing system has used 9-digit codes, and I was the person who manually entered the conversion cross-reference, all 1,240 lines of it. From that day forward, no one still working directly in the warehouse area could have written down a 7-digit code, because they saw 9-digit codes on every cargo compartment, every shift, every night. This report was drafted by someone who hasn't stood in the container yard in years." Paper began turning around the room. Marlo continued, her voice still as even as when she'd been reading reference numbers. "As for the 32-second recording from the light pole at the north corner, the person in the footage opens the cargo compartment latch with his right hand." She paused for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, "In warehouse number 3, everyone knows Mr. Halloran carries freight on his left shoulder. 4 years, not 1 load on his right. You can ask anyone who ever worked the night shift there." Bill was the first person to speak, and he asked only one question: "Have we verified this?" No one answered. Marlo closed the incident report and opened the final binder, a cheap gray ring binder bought from the office supply store on the corner. She said, "The rest of this isn't about money." Then she read, "Ruth Abernathy, 58 years old, warehouse division, 19 years. She didn't add another word. She moved to the second name, a forklift driver, 4 years. The third, an accounting employee, 2 years. The fourth, a night security guard, 7 years. The fifth name, the sixth. By the 9th, no one in the room was looking down at the documents anymore. She read all 11 names, closed the binder, and said, "I wrote these names down not because they're evidence. I wrote them down because no one else was going to remember them." At that exact moment, Cole Thackeray stood up at the far end of the table. He didn't look at Desmond Vance. He walked around to the head of the table, placed a small audio recorder in front of Harlan Briscoe, and said, "There are 3 calls on this, recorded from the evening of the 14th. He said, "I signed that report, and I know what I signed." Then he returned to his seat. No one said anything. Harlan pressed play, and in the conference room, on the 22nd floor of Ashgrove Holdings, among 15 people, with 3 men standing along the back wall and a glass wall overlooking the entire bay, Desmond Vance's voice came through clearly, reading to someone on the other end of the line the route schedule for the following month, 3 specific nights, the entry gate, the time window, and the price for each night. When he reached the 3rd night, his voice dropped, and he added that this route would cost more because after the following month, it wouldn't be going back into the other side's hands again. In the conference room, the oldest of the 3 men standing along the back wall closed his eyes briefly for a single beat, and it was the only movement any of them made throughout the entire morning. When the recording stopped, no one in the room said anything for nearly a minute. Then August Halloran said, "Everyone out except Mr. Vance." 14 people left the conference room on the 22nd floor in orderly silence, no one looking back, while the 3 men standing along the rear wall remained exactly where they were. Harlan Briscoe sat down in the chair nearest the door. Desmond Vance stayed beside his seat, with both hands resting on the back of the chair, and he was the first to speak. He said, "You know I have a piece of paper." August said, "I know." Desmond said, I have the addresses of both families in Dundalk. I've had the names of those two women written inside an envelope for 3 years. August said, I know that too. Then he continued, his voice no louder than before. But now that paper can't say what you want it to say anymore. It was entered into the 4th floor archive log on September 19th, 6 years ago, and removed at 10:12 in the morning on the 22nd under your signature. That original logbook was retrieved from the archive files and has been sitting on this table for the last 2 hours, right beside 2 years of other evidence. Take it down to Dundalk if you want. It won't prove that I signed it. It'll only prove that you carried it out of the records room 3 days after 2 men failed to come home. Desmond stood motionless for a very long time. Then he said, So what are you going to do to me? Somewhere far out on the bay, a tugboat sounded its horn, the noise carrying faintly through the glass. August said, You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to leave Baltimore. Desmond looked up. The 3 men along the rear wall didn't move, but something in the air of the room had changed, and both Desmond Vance and Harlan Briscoe understood exactly what it was. Because in the world all 3 of those men had lived in their entire lives. A man in Desmond Vance's position, after what had just come through the little recorder on the table, wasn't usually given an afternoon. He was being given one because Cormac Halloran had laid down a rule nearly 70 years earlier that this family didn't touch people who couldn't defend themselves. And now, at 46 years old, after selling 3 cargo routes and a name, Desmond Vance was standing in that room as a man who truly had nothing left with which to defend himself. August kept that rule even for him. That was the whole reason. Desmond Vance buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the door. At 3:50 that afternoon, an envelope was delivered to Harlan Briscoe's office, with no note attached. Inside was the original internal directive, dated September 19th, 6 years earlier. 6 years hanging around the neck of a 34-year-old man were lifted away in a single afternoon because someone on the 4th floor had written down the time a piece of paper was removed from a shelf on a day when she didn't even know August Halloran existed. Cole Thackeray was escorted out of the building close to noon. He didn't resist. As he passed the head of the table, he stopped as though he meant to say something, and August looked at him and said exactly 1 sentence. She said no, 3 times. Cole stood there for 1 more second, then kept walking. That afternoon, August personally called Ruth Abernathy. He said, This is Halloran from warehouse number 3. Ruth said, I know who you are now. 3 people called me this morning. He said, Your schedule has been restored. All 6 weeks that were taken from you will be paid retroactively, and you can come back any day you want. The other end stayed silent for about 4 seconds. She didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. Didn't say how long she'd been waiting for this. Didn't say a word about 19 years. She only asked, What time does my shift start? August said, 11 o'clock at night, ma'am. Ruth said, Then I'll be there at 10:30, and hung up. The one who cried was Marlowe. She was standing in the hallway on the 22nd floor when she heard August repeat that question, and she turned her face toward the wall, and in 8 years it was only the 2nd time she'd allowed herself to cry in front of another person. Near the end of the afternoon, August called her into the office at the end of the hallway and placed a sheet of paper on the desk. He said, I'm creating a new department, Internal Controls, with the authority to request any document from any department without needing approval from that department's head. I want you to lead it. Marlowe looked at the paper for quite a while. Then she pushed it back toward the middle of the desk and said, No. August didn't ask why right away. He waited. She said, If I take it today, then within a week this entire building will be saying that the girl from the 4th floor was handed a chair because she stood beside you in that conference room. And for the next 10 years, every time I ask someone to turn over a document, that will be the first thing they think before they hand it to me. I spent 8 years earning something no one can take away from me. I'm not trading it for a nameplate. August leaned back in his chair and looked at her, and for the first time in 4 years, something very close to a smile appeared on his face. He asked, Then what do you want? Marlowe said, 2 things. First, give Ruth Abernathy her job back in full. Not as a favor, but as a correction. And put the reason clearly in her personnel file, so that 20 years from now, if someone reads it, they'll know what really happened. August said, That's already done. What's the second thing? She said, Second, I want a window for the 4th floor records room. He looked at her. She said, I spent 8 months sitting under a light bulb that kept flickering once and then coming back on, and whoever sits there after me shouldn't have to do that anymore. August picked up his pen, pulled the paper back toward himself, drew a line through the heading, and on the back he wrote 2 lines of instructions to the facilities department. He signed beneath them, and it was the first signature he'd ever put on a document inside that building under his real name. The following Tuesday evening, Marlowe arrived at Elmridge later than usual, and Sister Maeve Donnelly was waiting for her in the hallway outside room number 14, with a yellowed paper envelope in her hand. She said, "I've kept this for 8 years, and I promised your father I would only give it to you when you asked." Marlowe said, "But I never asked." Sister Maeve said, "You did last week, when you told me what happened in that building, and mentioned that name." She held out the envelope and said, "I think it's time." Marlowe opened it right there in the hallway. Inside was a civil settlement agreement dated 8 years earlier, 3 pages long, with her father's signature on the final page, stating that he agreed to withdraw all complaints related to the fire in the building on the east side of the city and would pursue no further legal action in exchange for a payment of $40,000, clearly described as goodwill assistance and not an admission of liability. At the bottom corner of the second page, beneath the section identifying the representative who arranged the settlement, was a name she had read hundreds of times over the past 5 years, Desmond Vance. Marlowe stood motionless in the hallway for a very long time, and as she stood there, she began putting together a timeline she had never once connected before. That $40,000 had been transferred during the 2nd month after the fire. The 2nd month after the fire was when she was lying in the burn unit at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and her family's insurance had already reached its coverage limit by the 3rd week. She had always believed the hospital bills were paid with a loan secured against the old house. They weren't. Her father had signed this paper, and with that money he had paid for 2 skin graft surgeries on his daughter's left arm, and then he hadn't spoken a single word to her for 4 months, and then he hadn't told her anything about it for another 8 years. For all those 8 years, she had believed his silence was an accusation. It had never been an accusation. It was the shame of a man who had been forced to sell away his right to speak the truth about the death of one daughter in order to save the arm of the other, and he had never found a way to tell her that, so he had chosen to say nothing at all. Marlowe walked into room number 14. Her father sat in his wheelchair facing the window, just as he did every Tuesday evening. She pulled the chair closer, sat down on his right side, and placed the paper across her lap. She said, "I know now, Dad. I know what you signed." Then she said, "I'm sorry I've misunderstood you for 8 years." He didn't turn his head, but his right hand, the only hand he could still move, lifted from his lap, reached into the space between them, found her left wrist, and closed around the exact place where the scar was. He held it there for a very long time. Out in the hallway, Sister Maeve stood in the doorway and didn't come inside. 6 months later, the executive team at Ash Grove Holdings hired an independent consulting firm in Philadelphia to conduct a competency assessment for the position of head of internal controls, using an anonymous process in which applications were coded, and the review panel knew neither the names nor the current positions of any candidate. Of the 7 applications reviewed, the one identified as number 4 ranked highest in all 3 categories. When the sealed envelope was opened, candidate number 4 turned out to be a records clerk from the 4th floor. Marlowe Redgrave received her appointment letter on a Thursday morning, and she read it inside a room that now had a window, and this time she allowed herself to cry without turning her face toward the wall. Another year later, on a Saturday in early October, Ash Grove Holdings held a family day at warehouse number 3. They cleared all the pallets out of Section B, set up a long row of tables along the southern wall, and Ruth Abernathy stood in the middle of those tables handing out cake to everyone who passed, calling nearly all of them by name without having to ask. The workers' children were given balloons at the entrance and drew with colored chalk across the concrete floor of Section C, and by noon, a long stretch of the floor was covered with suns, houses, crooked ships, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through a warehouse that had once known only the noise of forklifts and rolling doors. August Halloran stood up to speak at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He didn't talk about revenue. He called the name of every person who had worked the night shift in warehouse number 3 during the previous 5 years, one by one, leaving no one out, and asked them to stand. Then he called Ruth Abernathy's name and said, 19 years, ladies and gentlemen." The entire warehouse applauded, and there were people there applauding men and women they had passed thousands of times, without ever once truly looking at them. Marlowe stood at the back of the room, She didn't go up to the platform. She didn't stand beside him. There was still a notebook in her hand. She was still writing things down. Some people enter our lives with a great deal of noise, and some people simply record everything in silence until the day the truth needs somewhere to stand. This story isn't about power, and it isn't about revenge. It's about something much simpler. That a person's worth isn't measured by the chair they sit in or the badge they wear, but by whether they're willing to truly see the people around them. A greeting that uses the right name. A cup of coffee left waiting on the edge of a desk. A hand that helps carry a box out to the parking lot on a day when no one else wants to speak to us. Those things are so small that the people who do them often don't remember them. But the people who receive them remember for the rest of their lives. And sometimes those very things are what keep someone from falling when they're already beginning to lose their footing. If you've stayed with August and Marlo all the way to this point, please press the like button, share this story with someone you think may need to hear it too, and subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. How did today's story make you feel, and which moment moved you the most? Leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.